1986. I met a young man, his name was Titus. And Titus was an epileptic, and he had had epilepsy since he was a child. And he had never been to town because the rice fields were terraces, and if you fall, you could break your neck. And there's just like a little mud wall. I used to think, oh God, and this is me after I had broken my leg in Nepal. And I cannot tell you, when I showed up at this place, and I'm like, God, what is it with you in mountains? Why? And they're like, I mean, these little tiny footpaths, and you know, here's me, and I ended up having to slide. I would always arrive at the village completely covered in mud because I would like scoot down. You know, I didn't care how muddy it was. I was not going to fall again. So anyhow, Titus was up in his hut, and he had never been in town. And this one day, somebody came to his hut and told him that there were people in town who knew Jesus, and that Jesus was healing people. Now, he had never heard of Jesus. He was pagan. You know, their family went to witch doctors and stuff. Somehow or other, he got the courage to make it through the rice paddies and come into the town, and he literally went from door to door saying, is Jesus here? And they're like, no. He was 17. Is Jesus here? No. Is Jesus here? No. And then somebody said, you know what? Go up there, those people know Jesus. And it was the youth with the mission base and the church. I'm sorry, it was the church. There was a Pentecostal church in the town. But some of the YWAMers worked in that church. So he goes up there, he says, is Jesus here? And the pastor kind of chuckled. He says, well, yes, he is. And he says, I need to talk to him. Okay. So he brought and he told his story. Well, of course, then they were able to explain that Jesus was the Son of God and told him the gospel, and he did pray to receive Christ. And then they laid hands on him, and he was healed like he did not have. Now, that would have been in 1984, okay? So I heard about this in 1986 because I met Titus. He was doing a DTS. He was on staff, and he was doing great. Okay, that was 1986. I came back later that year, and he was even growing more in the Lord. And then one day, I came down to the YWAM base, and everybody was really sad. And I'm like, what's going on? They said, Titus has been unconscious for 2 days. And I said, what do you mean unconscious? He had a huge seizure. And of course, there were no hospitals, there were no doctors, there was no medicine. You know, they had just gotten electricity 3 months before I showed up. They had nothing. You know, the running water was out of pipes out of the back. So, and I said, take me to him. So there he was on the bed, I mean, out cold. And I just knelt and I just held his hand and I started to pray and talk to God about Titus. And one of the things that puzzled me was this beautiful boy to have his healing robbed.
Yes.
I didn't like that. It didn't make any sense, and I was going through the scriptures trying to think of an example. I couldn't think of one. You know, like I said, even the lepers that were healed, there's no recorded event that they got that leprosy back. So what, Lord? And I'm praying and praying and praying, and I began to pray out loud for his healing, and I began to rebuke the devil. And I rose up and I began to just proclaim that Titus belongs to Jesus. And I went from pleading with God to standing against Satan and saying, you may not rob this child of his bread, for healing is the children's bread, and he's a child of God. And I began to declare and rebuke and cut off and ancestral things and anything and cut it all off in Jesus' name. And I prayed and prayed and prayed, and I laid hands on him, and he still just slept. And then all of a sudden, a groan came out of my innermost being, and I just wailed before God. I wailed, and I wept, and I wept, and I wailed. And I spoke in tongues, things I didn't understand, and he still slept. And I got up, but I had a sense that I had done all that I could do. So I left. And I went downstairs, and there were some people sitting in front of the building, and I sat with them, and all of a sudden I hear all this excitement, maybe about 15, 20 minutes later. And everybody's Titus is walking down the stairs. He'd been unconscious for 2 solid days. And he came downstairs and he was yawning and stretching like he'd had a long sleep. And do you know, that was in 1986. Dan and I went back in late 1989. And he was still healed, and he was teaching and preaching, and he was a man now. I believe he was even married with kids. You know, so I mean, healing is, sometimes we have to contest for it. That's like that woman about the children's bread. You know what I mean? Even the dogs will eat the bread that falls, right? We had to contest for this young man's healing. It was just not handed on a silver platter. That's because the enemy will try sometimes to contest it, but greater is he that is in us. And if we just do what we know how to do, and then just put the rest. Now I got to tell you something else, and this is my last point about this. I know many, many people who are really afraid to pray for people to get healed because they're so worried about the people being disappointed if they don't get healed. Right. What will happen? They won't have faith in God, or they'll feel condemned. There's a way to pray for people where they don't feel condemned. Welcome. You love them and you tell them that you're praying in the love of God. You know, if you're going to do any rebuking, it's of the enemy, not them. Right. And even though we know, like, if they were to exercise faith, that would be more powerful. But yet the scriptures do say that our prayers can also have power. What I've decided to do in my life is not worry about that. I just don't give myself that back door, you know, and I just say, okay, it's up to God. I believe that he heard me, and I believe that he is the healer. And so through that, not that everybody I've ever prayed for has gotten healed, but many, many, many have. Yes. Many have. Remember, we went and prayed for Pun that time in the hospital, and he was home like the next day. He was so sick. But then later, he went to be with Jesus. The next time we laid hands on him and prayed. You know, so, I mean, that was like a year or so later. Well, he had HIV at a time when there wasn't any cure for it. But, you know, and he died in my husband's arms, you know. But he was a great believer. He loved Jesus. And we are friends with his widow and his children to this very day through First Light. His oldest daughter is completing her, through her own scholarship. She got scholarships, but we helped her get through school, and then she went to college, and she's going to be graduating college. So that's a miracle. That's a miracle.